The rain came sideways that night, hammering the windows of a tour bus rolling through the dark toward Wisconsin. Inside, a 13-year-old girl with a voice that had already stunned millions sat curled by the window, watching the storm blur the world outside into streaks of gold and black. She had no way of knowing that within seconds, the road beneath her would turn to ice, that metal would scream against a guardrail, that everything she had built in a matter of months was about to be tested in a matter of heartbeats. Somewhere behind her, instruments rattled softly in their cases, and up ahead, headlights swept across sheets of falling water. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass, thinking of home, of her dog waiting by the door, of how strange it still felt that strangers across the world now knew her name. This is the story of how a voice from a tiny village in England shook America to its core, and how one rain-soaked night nearly took it all away. But to understand how far she fell, you first have to understand how impossibly high she had risen. Long before the bright lights and the screaming crowds, there was just a little girl in Heselden, County Durham, humming along to her mother's records with her hands raised in the air like she was already on a stage no one else could see. Courtney Hadwin was 3 years old when music first got its hooks into her, and by 8, her teachers were already calling her voice something they didn't have the right words for. Too rich, too old, too full of ache for a child who hadn't lived long enough to earn it. The other kids called her rocker girl. She never once flinched from a crowd. While most children her age were still finding their voices, Courtney was already learning how to bend hers around heartbreak she'd never experienced, chasing something bigger than the 4 walls of her bedroom mirror. She formed a little group with neighborhood kids, calling themselves Durham Soul, playing borrowed guitars on quiet streets for anyone who'd stop and listen. A local reporter wrote a short piece about the girl with the angelic voice, and her parents kept the clipping like a relic. Every weekend, her mother drove her to a theater school an hour away, where a vocal coach taught her not just how to sing, but how to feel a song before she opened her mouth, how to let the ache in a lyric live in her chest before it ever reached her throat. By 12, she was saving pocket change for a plane ticket, scribbling dreams into notebooks by lamplight, promising herself that Heselden would only be the beginning. What she didn't know yet was that in less than a year, the entire world would be watching. She landed in Omaha in the summer of 2018, carrying a suitcase, a leather jacket, and a single, impossible hope, a spot on America's Got Talent. She had never been to the United States before. Jet lag pulled at her limbs, but her mind was fixed on one thing only. Backstage, hopeful performers whispered in nervous clusters while producers called names into the silence, and contestants twice her age paced in circles, trying to shake off their nerves. When hers was finally called, she gripped her fedora like it was the only solid thing left in the world and walked into the lights, her audition form damp in her other hand. Nobody in that theater was prepared for what happened next. The band struck the opening chords of Piece of My Heart, and for a moment, Courtney's voice came out soft, almost shy, a girl standing very small under enormous lights. And then it cracked open into something ferocious. She stomped her foot, closed her eyes, and let a sound tear out of her that didn't belong to a 13-year-old body. It was raw and unpolished in all the right places, full of a grit that no vocal coach could teach. Simon Cowell leaned forward, eyebrows lifting. Howie Mandel covered his mouth, stunned. Heidi Klum sat frozen, wide-eyed, and Melby tapped her fingers on the table like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. By the time the final note rang out, the crowd was already on its feet, and Simon's golden buzzer light was raining down over the stage like confetti catching fire. By morning, 10 million people had watched her clip. By the next week, headlines were calling her the teen Janis Joplin. Talk show hosts wanted her. Jimmy Fallon surprised her with a live drumbeat behind a blues classic. Ellen DeGeneres hugged her like an old friend and laughed as she tried, and failed, to match Courtney's gravelly tone. Messages poured in from Tokyo, from Sao Paulo, from strangers who told her that her voice had made them feel alive again, that she reminded them of a daughter, a sister, a version of themselves they thought they'd lost. And through it all, Courtney kept doing the thing that made her different from every overnight sensation before her. She stayed exactly who she was. She called her parents after every show. She squeezed schoolwork between rehearsals and sound checks. She reminded herself, night after night, scribbling in a journal by lamplight, that she wasn't singing for fame. She was singing because it was the only way she knew how to be free. Record labels began circling. Merchandise companies asked about hoodies and t-shirts bearing her name. And still, she came back to the same handful of words her mother had given her before she ever stepped on a plane. Work hard, stay humble, remember why you started. By October, she was riding the wave of a small tour with fellow finalists, city to city, stage to stage. A girl who just months earlier had never left England, now living a life she'd only dared to dream about in a notebook. She had no idea that the very thing carrying her toward her future, a tour bus in the rain, was about to become the setting for the darkest night of her young life. It happened just after midnight on Interstate 94, on a stretch of highway known for turning dangerous in storms. The driver had done everything right, steady speed, careful hands, but sometimes the road doesn't care how careful you are. Rain had been falling for hours, pooling in the low patches along the shoulder, and as the bus rounded a curve, a gust of wind shoved it sideways toward the guardrail. The driver braked hard. It wasn't enough. For a few endless seconds, there was only the sound of skidding metal and shifting cargo, of instruments crashing from their cases, of overhead bins springing open and bodies thrown forward into darkness. And then silence. The kind of silence that follows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet, broken only by rain still tapping against the windows, and somewhere close, a muffled cry. Courtney sat stunned, blood tracing a thin line down her temple where she'd struck the luggage rack, her knee already screaming with pain she didn't yet have a name for. She unfastened her seatbelt with shaking hands and stood slowly, checking herself the way you check something you're afraid might be broken. Around her, her fellow performers stirred, bruised, shaken, but alive. The keyboardist cradled his wrist. The tour manager pressed a hand to a bruised shoulder. Outside, headlights from strangers' cars swept across the wreckage as passers-by stopped in the storm to help. Phones already pressed to their ears, calling for anyone who could come. When paramedics finally arrived, they moved calmly through the chaos, stretchers and medical kits in hand, checking each passenger in turn until they reached the girl whose voice had just conquered a continent, and found her fighting back tears, more worried about her career than her own condition. She answered every question they asked in a small, steady voice, describing the pain in her knee, the ringing in her head, agreeing without hesitation to be taken to the nearest hospital. At St. Mary's, the diagnosis came fast: a fractured kneecap, a mild concussion. No surgery, but 6 weeks of forced stillness, of limited screen time, of a body that needed to heal before it could ever perform again. For a girl whose entire identity had just been built on motion, on stomping feet and soaring notes and stages that never stopped moving, the sentence of rest felt almost crueler than the injury itself. Doctors explained the treatment plan step by step, and Courtney listened, nodding, before asking the only question that actually mattered to her. When could she sing again? Tour dates were canceled overnight. Refunds went out to fans in Wisconsin and Illinois, many of whom donated their ticket money straight into a GoFundMe that raised over $30,000 in under 2 days. Simon Cowell and Heidi Klum recorded messages of support from thousands of miles away, and fellow contestants sent videos expressing quiet relief that things hadn't been worse. 2 days later, Courtney flew home to England under medical supervision, and somewhere over the Atlantic, thousands of miles from Heselden, she had to ask herself the one question fame had never prepared her for. What happens to a voice like mine if I can never get back on that stage? Her parents were waiting at the airport with the kind of relief only a parent who has nearly lost their child can understand. Physical therapy began almost immediately in a small clinic near her village. Gentle stretches, careful bends of a knee that used to leap without hesitation, balance exercises that measured her progress in inches and seconds. She wasn't allowed to read for long. She wasn't allowed to stare at screens. All she could do, in the quiet hours between exercises, was hum softly to herself, just to make sure the fire hadn't gone out. Neighbors dropped off meals and homemade cards. One evening, a handful of local singers gathered beneath her window and performed a short concert on the driveway, their voices rising under a street lamp while Courtney watched from the porch, crutches leaning against her side, crying tears she didn't try to hide. Weeks passed. Her family turned an old garden shed into a makeshift studio, a microphone, 2 speakers, a laptop, nothing more. And there, alone in that small wooden room, Courtney faced the moment that mattered more than any golden buzzer or standing ovation. She stood without her crutches for the first time since the crash, closed her eyes, took a breath that felt heavier than any she'd taken on that stage in Omaha, and sang. The note came out clean, unbroken, just as fierce as it had ever been. She didn't cry from pain this time. She cried because the voice that had carried her across an ocean, that had made grown men in a talent show audience sit in stunned silence, was still hers. The crash hadn't taken it. Nothing had taken it. She recorded that first fragile practice and posted it online, and comments poured in almost instantly. Fans marveling not just that she'd survived, but that there was a new depth in her voice now. Something earned. Within weeks, she was back in front of an audience at a charity benefit in Newcastle, her knee brace hidden beneath the hem of a green dress, opening with a ballad she'd written herself during the long, quiet nights of her recovery. When she hit the final note, the crowd didn't just applaud. They rose, as if they understood exactly how much it had taken her to get back to that stage. What came after wasn't just a return to fame. It was a redefinition of what her voice was for. She joined a benefit towards supporting other young performers facing hardship, stood on stages in Chicago and London belting soul standard alongside artists she once only listened to on her mother's old records. She recorded an EP filled with songs about fear and gratitude,